It is not yet light, and you are already awake. Before the physicians arrive, before the gentlemen of the chamber, before the king himself is presented to the world as a king, you must enter the most private room in England. You are a groom of the privy chamber, and every morning begins the same way. It begins with the smell. You notice it before you even cross the threshold or draw back the heavy curtains around Henry VIII's bed. The air carries a strange mixture of sweetness and decay. Expensive perfumes try to smother the stench, covering it like a cloth thrown over a stain, but they never truly succeed. After enough mornings, you stop flinching. That is the secret no one would ever admit, not that the King of England smelled of rot, because everyone close to him already knew that, but that those closest to him had become accustomed to it. This is the story of that smell. It is the story of the wound that caused it, the perfumes designed to hide it, the mouth that rotted from within, and the handful of servants whose lives revolved around maintaining the body of a living king who could no longer care for himself. It is also the story of a remarkable secret. The most powerful man in Europe did not become disgusting in isolation. He became disgusting before an entire staff whose only purpose was to clean him, dress him, drain his wounds, perfume his body, and preserve the illusion that nothing was wrong. To understand everything that followed, you must begin with Henry's leg. In January 1536, Henry VIII was 44 years old. Although middle-aged by Tudor standards, he still thought of himself as the handsome young prince who had dazzled Europe with his athleticism. On January 24, while jesting at Greenwich Palace in full armour, disaster struck. Henry was thrown from his horse, and the enormous armoured animal crashed down on top of him. He lay unconscious for nearly 2 hours while the court believed their king was dead. Those 2 hours changed English history. Anne Boleyn, who was pregnant at the time, received the devastating news, and many historians believe the shock contributed to the miscarriage she suffered soon afterward, a tragedy that would ultimately lead to her execution. Henry survived the accident, but his body never truly recovered. Long before the fall, Henry already suffered from painful ulcers and swelling in his legs, likely caused by years of brutal jesting injuries. The accident transformed those lingering problems into something permanent. From that day until his death 11 years later, Henry lived with one or more open ulcers that refused to heal. To modern eyes, the obvious solution seems simple: clean the wound, close it, and allow it to heal. But Tudor medicine operated under an entirely different understanding of the human body. Physicians believed illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. In their view, Henry's constantly draining ulcer acted as a safety valve, allowing dangerous corruption to leave his body. Closing the wound, they believed, would trap those poisonous humors inside him and send them back toward his heart. Rather than trying to heal the ulcer, Henry's doctors deliberately kept it open. They packed it with dressings, cleaned it constantly, and may even have irritated it to prevent it from closing. To them, the foul-smelling wound represented successful treatment rather than medical failure. That horrifying smell filling the royal bedchamber every morning was therefore not the result of neglect. It was the intended outcome of the finest medical care money could buy. Every physician believed the stench meant the king's body was purging itself. Every servant accepted it as necessary. And every morning, it became the groom of the privy chamber's responsibility to manage the consequences. The dressings had to be removed and replaced. Basins filled with infected fluids had to be carried away. Heavy cloths soaked with discharge needed constant changing. Because of Henry's immense weight, several servants often worked together simply to shift his body enough to reach the wound without causing him unbearable pain. Over time, they learned every detail of the ulcer as intimately as another man might learn a foreign language. Yet no king could appear before his court smelling of decay. An entire industry developed around disguising Henry's condition. His chambers were covered with fresh herbs and fragrant rushes that released pleasant aromas when stepped upon. Bowls filled with dried flowers and spices stood in every corner. Henry carried a pomander, a small golden sphere filled with musk, ambergris, civet, rosewater, and other precious perfumes imported from across the world. His gloves were perfumed. His linen was perfumed. Even scented bags were hidden among his clothing. This obsession with fragrance was not merely vanity. Tudor people genuinely believed foul odors could spread disease through poisonous air known as miasma. Pleasant scents, therefore, were considered a form of medicine. Strong perfume did not simply hide the smell, it was believed to protect everyone in the room from illness. In their minds, musk and rosewater were helping to keep the king alive. Each day, the groom refreshed every scented herb, replaced every fragrant pouch, and refilled Henry's pomander. Even so, beneath all those expensive aromas, the unmistakable odor of infection remained. Everyone who served the king smelled it first thing every morning, and everyone silently pretended that they did not. Before Henry could appear before the court, he had to be carefully reconstructed. The stained linen from the night was quietly removed and carried away by servants sworn to absolute secrecy. Warm, fresh linen replaced it. The bandages covering the ulcer were gently peeled back, revealing a wound darkened by infection and soaked with fresh seepage. New dressings were applied with practiced precision, and every bloodied cloth and basin was quickly removed before anyone outside the king's closest circle could see them. Only after the wound had been hidden once again could the layers of royal clothing, rich furs, glittering jewels, and magnificent robes be added. Piece by piece, the helpless man lying in bed disappeared, replaced by the powerful image of England's king. By the time the chamber doors finally opened and the courtiers entered, the Henry they bowed before had already been carefully assembled by several loyal servants. Like stagehands preparing a grand performance before the audience arrived, these men knew exactly what lay beneath the expensive fabrics and glittering jewels because they had covered it with their own hands only moments earlier. But the leg was not the only source of decay. There was another form of rot slowly consuming Henry VIII, and this one had been created by his own appetite. In Tudor England, sugar was not an ordinary food. It was one of the most expensive luxuries a person could buy, imported from distant lands at enormous cost. Owning it was a public display of wealth, and no one possessed more of it than the king himself. Henry surrounded himself with extravagant sweet foods. His banquets displayed towering sugar sculptures shaped like castles, mythical beasts, and royal coats of arms. Sugared fruits, sweet wines, candied spices, comfits, and rich desserts appeared at nearly every feast. Consuming sugar in enormous quantities was more than indulgence, it was a declaration of status. Every bite reminded the court that Henry was the richest man in England. Ironically, the damage sugar caused to the teeth was not considered embarrassing. Quite the opposite. Blackened, decaying teeth became a symbol of wealth because only the rich could afford enough sugar to ruin them. Some poorer people were even rumored to darken their teeth intentionally, hoping to imitate the fashionable appearance of the wealthy. Rotten teeth became an unexpected badge of privilege. Unfortunately, Tudor dentistry offered almost no solutions. There were no fillings, no root canals, and no professional cleaning as we understand it today. Those who cared for their teeth rubbed them with rough cloths and abrasive powders made from salt, herbs, crushed bone, and other gritty materials that slowly wore away the enamel instead of protecting it. When a tooth became infected, most people believed the pain was caused by a tiny creature known as the tooth worm, an imaginary parasite supposedly burrowing through the root. The only treatment available was brutal extraction. A barber surgeon gripped the tooth with heavy iron forceps and pulled with all his strength. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and very little hope that the suffering would end quickly. Meanwhile, Henry's physicians faced an impossible task. They could not heal the king's ulcer because medical theory told them it must remain open. They could not repair his teeth because dentistry simply lacked the necessary techniques. They could not persuade the king to lose weight because Henry refused to deny himself the pleasures of food. Faced with problems they could not solve, the physicians did what many people throughout history have done when answers ran out. They performed the appearance of treatment. They prescribed herbs, adjusted bandages, discussed the balance of the four humors with great confidence, and surrounded the king with elaborate medical rituals. Whether these treatments actually helped mattered less than the appearance that something was being done. Telling Henry the truth that medicine had reached its limits would have been far more dangerous than pretending they still controlled the situation. During Henry's final decade, his mouth reflected the consequences of decades of luxury. Years of consuming vast amounts of sugar combined with primitive dental care almost certainly left him with severe tooth decay, abscesses, chronic infections, and terrible breath. Although no detailed dental records survive, the evidence speaks for itself. His immense wealth entered through his mouth as sweet luxury and gradually transformed into another source of pain, infection, and decay that expensive perfumes struggled to conceal alongside the stench from his leg. Henry's leg and his ruined teeth were only part of the tragedy. Both belonged to a body that was slowly disappearing beneath its own enormous weight. This is where one of the greatest myths about Henry VIII deserves to be challenged. Many people imagine that Tudor England was simply filthy and that Henry was merely dirtier than everyone else. The reality was far more complicated. In his younger years, Henry was actually considered remarkably clean. Hampton Court Palace even contained a private bathing room supplied with both hot and cold running water, an extraordinary luxury for the 16th century. More importantly, Tudor ideas of cleanliness did not depend primarily on bathing. Fresh linen was believed to draw sweat and impurities away from the body, so changing into clean underclothes was considered the equivalent of washing. Henry changed his linen frequently, making him one of the cleanest noblemen in England during his prime. That is what makes his decline so tragic. This is not the story of a king who had always been dirty. It is the story of a handsome, athletic, proud young monarch who gradually became trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him. Over time, cleanliness stopped being something he could do for himself and became something other people had to do for him. The transformation can still be measured today because Henry's armor survives. When he became king in 1509 at the age of 18, his armor reveals a waist of roughly 32 inches, the build of a powerful athlete and champion juster. Decades later, the armor tells a completely different story. The waist expands beyond 50 inches, the chest grows enormously, and historians estimate that by the end of his life Henry weighed close to 400 pounds. Suit after suit of armor records the silent story of a prince becoming a man who could barely stand without assistance. A man of that size suffering from an ulcer that never healed eventually lost much of his mobility. His physical decline was not simply unattractive, it became disabling. Climbing stairs became nearly impossible. Walking even short distances caused unbearable pain. As his condition worsened, servants were forced to invent new ways of moving England's king through his own palaces. Special carrying chairs, hoists, pulleys, and lifting devices appeared inside the royal residences. Palace records describe equipment designed specifically to transport Henry from one floor to another. Instead of walking, the king was lifted by teams of servants using ropes and mechanical systems, almost like heavy cargo being raised inside a warehouse. Every journey required planning, manpower, and complete discretion. Imagine the scene. Several strong men strained together on thick ropes while Henry's enormous body hung suspended between floors. Every servant understood how humiliating the sight truly was, yet none dared speak of it. Courtiers remained silent. Ambassadors rarely described it openly. The entire operation disappeared behind the same wall of secrecy that concealed the smell of the king's wound. By the final years of his reign, Henry could no longer perform even the most ordinary acts of personal hygiene without assistance. He could not bend easily, wash himself properly, care for his ulcer, or manage many of the most private functions of daily life. Every intimate task required trusted servants. His body had become a responsibility shared by others. Servants regularly shifted his enormous weight to prevent pressure sores from forming beneath him. They cleaned his skin, treated his wounds, changed his clothing, and managed every aspect of his physical care. The king who had once dominated the tournament field with strength and confidence now depended completely upon the quiet labor of men whose names history rarely remembers. At the center of this hidden world stood one remarkable office, the groom of the stool. Modern readers often laugh at the title because, on paper, it sounds like the least desirable position imaginable. Officially, the groom supervised the king's clothes stool, or royal toilet. Yet in reality, it became one of the most influential appointments in the entire kingdom. The reason was simple. No one spent more private time with the king than the man responsible for attending him during his most vulnerable moments. Dukes, bishops, generals, and ambassadors might meet Henry in public ceremonies, but the groom of the stool saw the king as an ordinary human being every single day. He witnessed the condition of Henry's wounds, the state of his health, and the realities hidden behind every royal portrait. That extraordinary access created extraordinary political power. Men such as Sir Henry Norris and later Sir Anthony Denny became far more than household servants. They became trusted confidants whose influence extended directly into the center of government. By the final years of Henry's reign, Anthony Denny controlled the royal dry stamp, allowing official documents to receive the king's signature even when Henry himself was too weak to sign them. The man who managed the king's most private physical needs had, in effect, gained direct access to the machinery of royal authority itself.